Before we begin, a quick note. This story delves into unsettling themes and may not be suitable for all listeners. Viewer discretion is advised. They were called the Spectral Seekers, for seasoned ghost hunters whose names were practically legendary in the online paranormal community. Michael, the stoic leader with an almost uncanny intuition, Jessica, the brilliant tech guru, always armed with the latest gadgets and a healthy dose of skepticism, David, the meticulous historian, who could unearth a century of forgotten secrets with a single search query, and Emily, the newest member, a sensitive with a quiet strength and an unnerving ability to pick up on residual energies. For years, they had ventured into the darkest corners of America, documenting phenomena others dared only whisper about, uncovering truths and debunking myths with equal precision. But then came Blackwood Asylum. Blackwood wasn't just another abandoned building with a spooky past. It was a gaping wound in the landscape of human suffering, a place where the veil between worlds felt impossibly thin, stretched taut by decades of despair, neglect, and unspeakable medical practices. Nestled deep within the desolate pine forests of upstate New York, its Gothic stone facade loomed like a petrified nightmare against the sky, its broken windows staring out like vacant eyes. Local legends spoke of patient screams still echoing through its decaying halls, of doctors who vanished, and of a pervasive malevolent presence that seemed to feed on the very sanity of anyone who dared to linger. The Spectral Seekers had tackled haunted houses, cursed cemeteries, and even a notorious prison known for its violent apparitions. But Blackwood was different. They knew it. Their fans knew it. This wasn't just another investigation. It was the Everest of their careers, the one location that promised to either validate every claim they'd ever made or break them completely. And they had promised their millions of followers an unprecedented, live-streamed multi-night deep dive into its very core. On October 27th, precisely at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Spectral Seekers, armed with their array of cameras, EMF detectors, thermal imagers, and audio recorders, breached the rusted gates of Blackwood Asylum. Their last broadcast, a shaky, static-laden feed, showed Michael kicking open the heavy oak main doors, revealing a cavernous, dust-choked lobby, eerily lit by their powerful headlamps. Jessica was adjusting a camera on her shoulder, her brow furrowed in concentration. David, ever the historian, was already pointing out architectural details, his voice a low hum of excitement. Emily, however, was silent, her eyes wide, scanning the shadows, a faint tremor in her hands even then. "All right, team," Michael's voice had boomed, a forced bravado barely concealing an underlying tension. "This is it. Blackwood. Let's make history." They walked into Blackwood and they never walked out. The live stream abruptly cut out at 3:17 a.m. on October 28th. Not with a crash, not with a scream, but with a sudden, absolute silence, a blank screen, and an error message that simply read, "Connection lost." For the first few hours, their vast audience assumed it was a technical glitch, a common occurrence in such remote, dilapidated locations. But as the sun rose, casting long, accusing shadows over the asylum, and no updates emerged from the team, a cold dread began to set in. By noon, panicked fans had flooded social media, demanding answers, fearing the worst. Local authorities were alerted. A search and rescue team, accompanied by a small contingent of state troopers, was dispatched to Blackwood Asylum. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, only deepened the chilling mystery. The rusted gates were still ajar, exactly as the Spectral Seekers had left them. Their custom-built, fully equipped exploration van was parked just outside the perimeter fence, its doors locked, its windows intact. Inside, investigators found their personal effects: wallets, phones, car keys, even a half-eaten bag of trail mix. Everything was there untouched except for the 4 people who owned it all. The asylum itself was a labyrinth of decay. Every room, every corridor, every forgotten ward was meticulously searched. The search party found their abandoned equipment: tripods toppled, cameras smashed, audio recorders lying inert on grimy floors. But there was no sign of Michael, Jessica, David, or Emily. No struggle, no forced entry or exit points, no blood, no notes, no trace whatsoever of what might have happened to them. It was as if the very air inside Blackwood Asylum had simply absorbed them. They had vanished without a single solitary clue. The official police report, released weeks later, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement, concluding that 4 individuals are missing, presumed lost within the extensive and hazardous structure of Blackwood Asylum. But everyone knew that was a lie. These weren't amateur hikers who'd wandered off a trail. These were experienced professionals, intimately familiar with dangerous environments, equipped with GPS trackers, satellite phones, and emergency beacons, none of which had ever been activated. The narrative of their disappearance quickly morphed into an urban legend, whispered in hushed tones across the internet. Had they encountered something truly otherworldly? Something so terrifying it defied human comprehension? Had the asylum, with its dark history and malevolent energy, finally claimed its ultimate victims? Or was there a more sinister, more grounded explanation lurking beneath the surface of the supernatural rumors? The world watched, captivated and horrified, as the story of the ghost hunters who never returned from Blackwood Asylum became a chilling testament to the unknown. For years, the case remained cold, a persistent, gnawing question mark in the annals of unexplained disappearances. Blackwood Asylum, already infamous, became even more so, a forbidden zone, a monument to a mystery no one could solve. But then, almost a decade after the spectral seekers vanished, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. It wasn't found in a dusty police archive or unearthed by a dedicated cold case detective. It came from an unlikely source, a forgotten corner of the internet, a digital whisper from the past. A former technician, who had once worked on the Spectral Seekers production team, claimed to have uncovered something extraordinary, something that had been buried deep within an old server, a corrupted data file from that fateful night, a fragment of what was supposed to be their final live broadcast. It was incomplete, distorted, barely audible, but if what he claimed was true, it contained a chilling revelation. It wasn't just a technical glitch that had silenced the Spectral Seekers. It was something else entirely, something that had been actively working against them. This wasn't just a story about a haunted asylum. This was a story about what happens when the hunters become the hunted. This was a story about the thin line between belief and terror, and what lies waiting on the other side. This was a story about Blackwood Asylum, and the 4 souls it swallowed whole. And it was about to get a lot darker. And it was about to get a lot darker. Our story begins not with the asylum itself, but with the individuals who dared to challenge its silence. They called themselves the Paranormal Pioneers, a small dedicated team of ghost hunters who had carved out a niche in the digital realm with their high-quality investigations and a reputation for uncovering genuine anomalies. Their leader was Michael Vance, a man in his late 30s with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held the quiet intensity of someone who had seen things that defied explanation. Michael was the team's anchor, a seasoned investigator who walked the fine line between a healthy skepticism and an unwavering belief in the unseen. He demanded empirical evidence, yet he was driven by an almost spiritual curiosity, a need to understand the echoes left behind by human suffering. Beside him was Jessica Riley, the team's brilliant technical expert and researcher. Jessica was all sharp intellect and focused energy, her dark hair often pulled back in a practical ponytail. She meticulously calibrated their EVP recorders, thermal cameras, and EMF detectors, always searching for the quantifiable data, the scientific proof that could validate their experiences. She was the one who pored over historical documents, unearthing the forgotten stories that gave context to their investigations. While Michael sought the truth, Jessica sought the explanation, the mechanism behind the mystery. She was logical, often cautious, and her quiet apprehension was usually the first indicator that they were truly stepping into something profound. Then there was David Chun, the team's primary cameraman and audio specialist. David was the quiet observer, often blending into the background, his presence marked only by the steady hum of his equipment. He possessed an artistic eye, capturing not just the visual evidence, but the very mood of a location. David had an uncanny knack for sensing shifts in atmosphere, for picking up on subtle sounds that others missed, and his calm demeanor often masked a deep sensitivity to the energies around them. He was the one who often felt things first, a chill that wasn't from the draft, a whisper that wasn't static. The newest member, and arguably the most enthusiastic, was Emily Hayes. Fresh out of college with a degree in folklore and a boundless passion for the paranormal, Emily was a whirlwind of energy and youthful optimism. She was the team's social media liaison, their public face, connecting with their audience and injecting a vibrant curiosity into their often somber investigations. Emily saw every creak and shadow as a potential story, every cold spot as an invitation. Her eagerness was infectious, but also perhaps a touch naive, a belief that the spirits they sought were primarily misunderstood, rather than malevolent. Together, they had successfully navigated countless haunted houses, abandoned prisons, and spectral battlegrounds, each investigation bolstering their confidence and expanding their digital footprint. But Blackwood Asylum. Blackwood was different. It was the Everest of their world, the ultimate challenge that had eluded even the most hardened paranormal explorers. Its name alone resonated with a chilling finality, a whispered warning among those who dared to listen. Blackwood Asylum wasn't just old. It was ancient, a behemoth of decaying brick and shattered glass that loomed like a forgotten sentinel against the backdrop of an unforgiving wilderness. Constructed in the late 1800s, it had been a pioneer in psychiatric care, promising healing and hope. But like so many institutions of its era, its grand ambitions had slowly curdled into something far darker. Tales of its early days spoke of compassionate doctors and innovative therapies, but by the mid-20th century, Blackwood had become synonymous with cruelty, unethical experiments, and a profound disregard for human dignity. Patients, often misdiagnosed or simply inconvenient, were subjected to barbaric treatments, ice water shock therapy, crude lobotomies, and prolonged isolation in solitary confinement cells that were little more than glorified cages. The asylum abruptly closed its doors in 1967, not with a public announcement or a formal closure ceremony, but with a sudden, unexplained abandonment. One day, the staff simply left, leaving behind patient files scattered across desks, medical instruments still gleaming on sterile trays, and most disturbingly, patients still confined to their rooms. It was as if a silent alarm had been pulled, sending everyone fleeing in a blind panic. The official story was financial insolvency, a dwindling patient population, and a changing landscape of mental health care. But the whispers, the local legends, told a different, far more unsettling tale. They spoke of a mass disappearance, not just of patients, but of a significant portion of the staff, vanishing without a trace in the weeks leading up to the closure. They spoke of doctors driven mad by what they witnessed, nurses found catatonic in the hallways, and a pervasive, suffocating dread that seeped into the very foundation of the building. For decades, Blackwood Asylum stood untouched, a monument to forgotten suffering. Locals avoided it. Even the most daring teenagers rarely ventured beyond its overgrown perimeter wall, deterred by the chilling stories and an instinctual sense of self-preservation. It was said that the asylum wasn't just haunted. It was alive, a predatory entity that fed on fear and despair. People claimed to hear the phantom screams of patients echoing through the empty halls, to see shadowy figures darting between broken windows, and to feel an inexplicable coldness, a profound sadness that seemed to cling to the very air around it. It was these extreme, persistent rumors, coupled with a complete lack of verifiable inside footage, that had finally caught Michael Vance's attention. He'd initially dismissed Blackwood as an urban legend, too sensational to be true, but the sheer volume of consistent, terrifying accounts spanning generations began to chip away at his skepticism. No one had ever truly documented Blackwood. No team had ever stayed longer than a few hours, and even those brief expeditions often ended with investigators fleeing in terror, their equipment mysteriously malfunctioning, their reports filled with disjointed, fear-soaked accounts. This wasn't just another haunted house. This was an untouched vault of paranormal activity, a place where the veil between worlds felt impossibly thin. For Michael, it represented the ultimate validation, the chance to prove once and for all that there were forces at play that science had yet to comprehend. The decision to investigate Blackwood was not made lightly. Weeks were spent poring over historical archives, old newspaper clippings, and obscure medical journals. Jessica meticulously cross-referenced every patient record they could find, every staff roster, searching for patterns, for anomalies, for anything that might hint at the true nature of the asylum's abandonment. Emily, meanwhile, delved into the local folklore, interviewing elderly residents who remembered Blackwood in its final, terrifying years, gathering their hushed warnings and chilling anecdotes. David spent countless hours testing and retesting their sophisticated array of cameras, audio recorders, and environmental sensors, ensuring every piece of equipment was in perfect working order, ready to capture even the faintest whisper or the most fleeting shadow. As the day of their departure drew closer, an undeniable shift occurred within the team. The usual pre-investigation excitement was overshadowed by a creeping unease. Jessica, usually so composed, found herself double-checking her notes with a nervous intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration. David, typically quiet, grew even more withdrawn, his gaze often distant, as if already perceiving the unseen. Even Emily's boundless enthusiasm was tempered by a newfound sobriety, a quiet respect for the gravity of their undertaking. Michael, ever the stoic leader, maintained a calm exterior, but the faint lines around his eyes seemed to deepen, betraying the immense pressure he felt. He knew this wasn't just another investigation. This was a pilgrimage into the heart of darkness, a journey from which they might not return unchanged, if they returned at all. The drive to Blackwood was long, taking them deeper and deeper into a remote, forgotten corner of the state. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to a barely discernible dirt track overgrown with weeds and encroaching forest. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The chirping of birds, once a constant companion, slowly faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The landscape itself seemed to morph, becoming wilder, more untamed, as if nature itself had conspired to reclaim the land around the asylum, isolating it from the sanity of the modern world. Finally, through a dense thicket of skeletal trees, a monstrous silhouette emerged against the bruised twilight sky. Blackwood Asylum. It wasn't just a building. It was an entity, a hulking mass of crumbling stone and shattered windows that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its jagged roofline clawed at the clouds, and its empty windows, like countless vacant eyes, stared out with an ancient, malevolent gaze. A rusted, wrought-iron gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to the overgrown drive, a silent, mocking invitation. A chill, unlike any they had ever felt, permeated the air, seeping into their bones, a coldness that spoke not of temperature, but of an absence of life, an overwhelming presence of something profoundly wrong. They had arrived, and Blackwood Asylum was waiting. The heavy wrought-iron gates, rusted into a permanent scowl, groaned under Michael's efforts, but refused to budge more than an inch. It was clear the main entrance was a non-starter. David, ever the pragmatist, was already circling the perimeter, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom that clung to the asylum's walls like a shroud. Emily, however, stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the crumbling facade, a silent testament to decades of neglect and untold suffering. A shiver, not of cold but of profound unease, traced its way down her spine, a sensation she knew all too well was not her own. "There!" David called out, his voice a strained whisper against the vast silence. "Side door. Looks like the frame rotted out years ago. Should be able to pry it open." Michael joined him, assessing the dilapidated wooden door. It was warped and splintered, hanging precariously on a single rusted hinge. With a collective grunt, he and David put their shoulders to it. The wood groaned, protesting with an unearthly shriek that seemed to echo from the very heart of the building, before finally giving way with a mournful sigh. A gust of stale, frigid air, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and forgotten flowers, rushed out to greet them. Jessica, usually the first to charge in, hesitated. Her flashlight beam danced nervously across the gaping maw of the entrance. "Anyone else feel like we just opened a tomb?" she murmured, her bravado momentarily eclipsed by the palpable dread seeping from the asylum's depths. Emily nodded, her face pale. "It's not empty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's full." Michael, ever the leader, took a deep breath, trying to project an air of calm he didn't entirely feel. "All right, team. Let's stick together. David, you're on point with the thermal and EMF. Jessica, audio and video. Emily, keep your senses sharp. I'll be documenting everything." He clicked on his own powerful headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path into the inky blackness. "Remember the protocol. No heroics. Call out anything unusual. We're in, we get our evidence, and we get out." One by one they stepped across the threshold, their boots crunching on debris-shattered glass, crumbled plaster, and something unidentifiable that felt brittle and hollow beneath their weight. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows, a decaying monument to forgotten pain. The air inside was even colder, a deep, pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone and mortar. It was a cold that bit, not just at their skin but at their resolve. Their flashlights illuminated a long, narrow corridor, once pristine, now a decaying artery of the asylum. Peeling paint hung from the walls like tattered skin, revealing layers of faded institutional green and sickly yellow beneath. Overhead, exposed electrical conduits snaked across the ceiling, their wires dangling like severed nerves. Broken light fixtures, their bulbs long shattered, hung like empty eyes. EMF is spiking, David announced, his voice tight with concentration. His handheld meter, usually a reliable gauge, was fluctuating wildly, its digital display jumping from low background radiation to alarming bursts of activity. Not consistent, though. It's like bursts of energy, and it's not localized. It's everywhere. Jessica, her camera held steady, scanned the corridor. Audio's picking up something. A low hum? No, wait. It's more like a distant murmur. Too faint to make out words, but it's definitely there. She adjusted her headphones, her brow furrowed. It's almost like a crowd whispering. Emily pressed her palms together, her eyes darting around the oppressive space. The whispers, they're angry and sad. So much sadness here. She winced, a faint tremor running through her. It's like they're trying to tell us something, but the words are just static in my head. Michael moved slowly, methodically, his camera recording every detail. He ran his hand along a wall, feeling the damp, crumbling plaster. This place isn't just old, it's heavy. You can feel the weight of every moment that happened here. They ventured deeper, each step echoing unnaturally in the vast silence. The corridor eventually opened into a cavernous reception area, complete with a long, decaying counter that likely once served as a check-in desk. Behind it, a wall of rusted mail slots still bore faded, handwritten names, many illegible, others eerily clear. Patient Ward B, Dr. Peterson, Nurse Miller. Dust motes danced in their flashlight beams, making the air shimmer and distort. Jessica's camera suddenly glitched, the image on her monitor momentarily scrambling into static before correcting itself. "Whoa, did you see that?" she exclaimed, adjusting her grip. The camera just freaked out. "Mine too," David chimed in, pointing to his thermal imager. "Just got a massive cold spot reading, then it vanished." In the middle of the room, nothing there now. Michael felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. These weren't just equipment quirks. Blackwood was actively interfering. He remembered the stories, the urban legends of electronics failing, batteries draining inexplicably. They were witnessing it firsthand. As they explored the reception area, Emily stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on something in the corner. "Look," she breathed, pointing a trembling finger. Their flashlights converged on a small wooden rocking chair, half hidden by a collapsed pile of ceiling tiles. It was old, child-sized, and strangely out of place in a reception area. But what caught their attention was not the chair itself, but what lay slumped in it. A tattered, faded teddy bear, one button eye missing, its stuffing spilling from a torn seam. It looked like it had been left there yesterday, not decades ago. "That's creepy," Jessica muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael approached cautiously, his camera focused on the bear. A child's toy, in an asylum. Doesn't exactly fit the typical narrative, does it? He reached out a gloved hand, careful not to disturb anything, and gently pushed the chair. It rocked with a slow, deliberate creak, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the building, each swing a mournful lament. As the chair rocked, Emily gasped. I see her," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "A little girl. She's crying. She's looking for her bear. She's afraid." The air around the rocking chair plummeted in temperature. Even Michael, the most grounded of the group, felt the distinct, bone-chilling drop. David's thermal camera, which had just been acting up, now displayed a perfect, deep blue outline of a small figure sitting in the chair, radiating a profound coldness. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the image vanished, leaving only the rocking chair and the forlorn teddy bear. Jessica stumbled back a step, her face pale. Okay, that was real. Not just a feeling. Not just a glitch. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just residual energy. This was something active, something intelligent, something that reacted to their presence. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice a little hoarser than he intended. They nodded, shaken but still resolute. They were here for evidence, and Blackwood was delivering. But the nature of that delivery was far more terrifying than any of them had anticipated. They continued their exploration, moving through a series of administrative offices, each one a tableau of forgotten lives. Desks were overturned, papers scattered like autumn leaves, and broken typewriters lay rusting on the floor. In one office, they found a filing cabinet, its drawers half open, spilling out patient records. Michael, ever the historian, carefully picked up a yellowed file. The name on the tab was barely legible. Eleanor Vance. Admitted. 1948. Diagnosis: hysteria, delusions of persecution. As he read the file, a gust of wind, though there were no open windows, swept through the room, rattling the loose papers and making the fluorescent light fixture above their heads swing precariously. A low guttural growl, impossibly close, reverberated through the air, vibrating in their chests. It wasn't human, not entirely, but it was filled with an ancient, simmering rage. David's EMF meter screamed, peaking at an unprecedented level, its alarms blaring frantically. Jessica's camera, which had been recording steadily, suddenly went black, the battery indicator showing 0, despite being fully charged just moments before. Emily clutched her head, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Get out! It doesn't want us here. It's angry!" she cried, her voice laced with genuine terror. Michael felt a primal urge to flee, to retreat from the suffocating malevolence that now seemed to press in on them from all sides. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a creeping despair, a draining of hope, a whisper in the deepest parts of their minds telling them they were not welcome, and that they were in profound danger. This wasn't just a place of ghosts. It was a place of active, potent darkness. They had stepped through the door of Blackwood Asylum, and it had welcomed them with a chilling embrace, an embrace that tightened with every passing moment, threatening to crush their resolve and their very sanity. The asylum was alive, and it was watching them, waiting. Michael, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence that had swallowed them whole. "All right, team, comms check. Jessica, Mike levels." His voice, usually steady, had a subtle tremor, betraying the unease he felt despite his efforts to project calm. Jessica, her face illuminated by the glow of her tablet, tapped a few keys. "All green on my end, Michael. Audio feed is clear, video's transmitting. But the EMF reader is already spiking." She held up a small device, its lights flickering erratically, a frantic dance of red and green. "It's not just a little spike, it's sustained, like we're standing in an electrical storm." David, the historian, adjusted the strap of his backpack, his gaze sweeping across the grimy, peeling paint of the entrance hall. "Perhaps it's old wiring? This place must be a century old at least." His words lacked conviction even to his own ears. The air here was heavy, not just with dust and decay, but with something else, something cold and watchful. Emily, usually quick with a skeptical retort, remained quiet, her arms wrapped around herself. The chill had nothing to do with the temperature. It was an internal cold, a pervasive dread that seeped into her bones. Sarah, however, was visibly struggling. Her eyes were wide, darting from shadow to shadow, her breathing shallow and ragged. She clutched a small, smooth river stone in her hand, her knuckles white. "Sarah? You okay?" Michael asked, stepping closer to her. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It's so loud here, Michael. The echoes, the sadness. It's like 1,000 voices screaming, but I can't understand any of them. Just pain. So much pain." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though he felt a pang of helplessness. He didn't understand what Sarah experienced, but he trusted her intuition. If she said it was loud, it was loud. And if she said it was pain, then pain was what permeated Blackwood Asylum. "We're a team, Sarah. We're in this together. We'll stick close." With a nod of grim determination, Michael led the way, his powerful flashlight beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. They moved deeper into the asylum, their footsteps echoing eerily on the grimy linoleum floor. The main corridor stretched out before them, a seemingly endless tunnel flanked by countless closed doors, each promising untold stories of suffering within. The air grew colder with every step, and the feeling of being watched became almost palpable, a prickling sensation on the back of their necks. It was as if the very walls were breathing, exhaling the stale, forgotten memories of its former inhabitants. Jessica's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. "Guys, my thermal imager is picking up something. A cold spot. Right there." She pointed a trembling finger towards a wall on their left, where the heat signature on her screen plummeted dramatically, a stark blue against the otherwise muted greens and yellows. "It's moving." As she spoke, the cold spot on the thermal imager seemed to drift, slowly, deliberately, down the corridor, then through a closed door. Michael shone his flashlight at the spot where it had vanished, but saw nothing but flaking paint and a faded number 11. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered. her voice tight with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. "It just went through the wall." David, ever the academic, attempted a rational explanation. "Could be a draft, a sudden drop in temperature from a broken window in that room." But even he knew it sounded hollow. The feeling of something unseen, yet undeniably present, was growing stronger. They continued their slow, deliberate progression, each member of the team acutely aware of the silence that pressed in around them, broken only by their own ragged breaths and the occasional click of Jessica's equipment. The doors they passed seemed to watch them, their faded numbers like vacant eyes. Room 12, Room 13, Room 14, each one a tiny tomb for forgotten lives. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past Michael's ear. It was indistinct, a mere breath of sound, but it made the hair on his arm stand on end. He spun around, flashlight beams sweeping frantically, but there was nothing. Just the endless corridor, the closed doors, the oppressive darkness. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head, her face pale. "Hear what?" Sarah, however, nodded slowly, her eyes wide with terror. "Yes, I did. It was a name. My name. Sarah." Her voice cracked. "It knows my name." A chill far deeper than the asylum's oppressive cold seeped into their very souls. This wasn't just residual energy. This was something intelligent, something that knew them. Michael felt a tremor of true fear. They were no longer just observers, they were being observed. "Stay together, everyone," Michael commanded, his voice regaining some of its authority, though it was now laced with an undeniable urgency. "Let's head to the central common room. It's marked on the blueprints as a large open space. We can get our bearings there, set up a base." He hoped a larger, less confined space would offer some psychological relief, though he doubted it would deter whatever malevolent presence resided here. As they approached a junction in the corridor, a sudden jarring clang echoed from deeper within the asylum. It sounded like metal striking concrete, sharp and violent, followed by a low guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath their feet. Jessica gasped, dropping her tablet. It clattered to the ground, its screen flickering wildly before going dark. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David, usually composed, looked genuinely terrified. That wasn't just the wind." Michael quickly retrieved Jessica's tablet, trying to restart it, but it remained stubbornly unresponsive. "My equipment's failing," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "The EMF reader is going crazy off the charts. And my audio recorder, it's just static." As if on cue, a sudden burst of static erupted from the walkie-talkie clipped to Michael's belt, followed by a distorted, high-pitched shriek that was unmistakably human, yet utterly unnatural in its intensity. It morphed into a chilling, fragmented whisper that seemed to speak directly into their minds. "Get out." The message was clear, terrifying, and utterly unmistakable. This place didn't just want them gone. It was actively trying to force them out. Emily, her face white as a sheet, clutched Michael's arm. "Michael, we need to go. Now, this isn't just a haunting. This is something else." Her skepticism had completely vanished, replaced by raw primal fear. Sarah had collapsed to her knees, clutching her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no. The pain. It's so much worse now. It's angry. It's so angry." She rocked back and forth, muttering incoherently. Michael knew they couldn't turn back, not yet. They had come too far. And the asylum felt like a trap that had already sprung shut behind them. Retreating now felt impossible, like trying to run from a nightmare that had already taken hold. He helped Sarah to her feet, his gaze sweeping the darkened corridor. "We keep moving. We find that common room. We regroup." His voice was firm, but the tremor was back, more pronounced this time. Just as he finished speaking, the light from his powerful flashlight began to flicker, dimming erratically, threatening to plunge them into absolute darkness. The air grew impossibly cold, and a distinct putrid smell, like rotting flesh and stale disinfectant, filled their nostrils, gagging them. They pressed forward, a desperate huddle against the encroaching dread. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the shadows deepening, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced at the periphery of their vision. They passed what appeared to be a nurse's station, its counter still littered with ancient, rusted instruments and yellowed patient files. Michael's flashlight beam briefly caught a name on one of the files. Eleanor Vance. A new sound joined the symphony of terror. A low, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, coming from ahead of them, from the very direction they were headed. It was slow, deliberate, and undeniably approaching. The sound was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thump. 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 What is that? David whispered, his voice barely audible above his chattering teeth. Michael didn't answer. He didn't know. But the sound was growing louder, closer. The asylum wasn't just watching them anymore. It was moving. It was coming for them. The chilling embrace of Blackwood Asylum was tightening, not just around their resolve, but around their very bodies, threatening to drag them down into the suffocating darkness, to make them just another forgotten echo within its crumbling walls. They had stepped through the door of Blackwood Asylum, and it had welcomed them with a chilling embrace, an embrace that tightened with every passing moment, threatening to crush their resolve and their very sanity. The asylum was alive, and it was watching them, waiting. Now it was hunting them. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence that pressed in from all sides. Michael felt at first a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Not cold, but a deep, pervasive wrongness that seeped into his bones. His flashlight beam, once a reassuring spear of light against the oppressive darkness, now seemed to shrink, its glow absorbed by the hungry shadows that danced just beyond its reach. He tightened his grip on the camera, his knuckles white. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, tried to rationalize the sudden drop in temperature, the inexplicable whispers that seemed to coil around them from unseen corners. "It's just the old building settling," she murmured, her voice thin, betraying the tremble in her resolve. But even as she spoke, a distant, wet thud echoed from somewhere deep within the building, a sound that resonated not with crumbling plaster, but with something organic, something alive. David, usually focused on his array of meters and sensors, frantically tapped at his EMF detector. The device, which had been sporadically spiking, now flatlined, then suddenly screamed, a high-pitched wail that tore through the silence before dying abruptly. Its screen went dark. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking it, his face pale in the dim light. "It just died." His voice was laced with a fear that went beyond a simple equipment malfunction. This wasn't a dead battery. This was a deliberate silencing. Emily, however, felt it most acutely. Her head snapped up, eyes wide and unfocused, as if peering into a dimension invisible to the others. A gasp tore from her throat, a sound of pure terror. It's angry," she whispered, her hands flying up to cover her ears, though no audible sound seemed to plague the others. "It wants us out. Or, it wants us to stay." Her words were a chilling paradox, each option equally horrifying. A low guttural growl rumbled through the floor beneath their feet, a vibration that shook the very foundations of the building, rattling loose debris from the ceiling. Dust rained down on them, stinging their eyes, filling their mouths with the taste of decay and forgotten sorrow. The single working light bulb in the hallway above them flickered wildly, then exploded with a sharp crack, plunging them into absolute darkness. Panic, raw and visceral, clawed at Michael's throat. "Flashlights! Everyone, flashlights!" he barked, his voice strained. His own light beam cut through the sudden black, revealing the terrified faces of his team, illuminated like ghosts in their own right. As their individual beams pierced the gloom, a new horror unfolded. The hallway, which had moments ago stretched ahead, now seemed to twist and contort. Doors they had passed, marked with faded numbers, appeared to shift, their positions subtly altered. A feeling of disorientation washed over them, a sickening sensation that the very architecture of the asylum was rearranging itself around them. "This isn't right," Jessica breathed, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly. "We just came from that way. The door to the records room. It's gone." Michael spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was right. The familiar landmarks, their mental map of the asylum, were dissolving. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, the shadows deepening and shifting, taking on monstrous, fleeting forms. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed from what felt like inches away, though no one was there. It was a sound of unimaginable agony, a human voice stretched to its breaking point, then abruptly cut off. Emily screamed, a high-pitched, involuntary cry of terror that was quickly stifled as she clamped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "What was that?" David stammered, his body trembling uncontrollably. His hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, a small non-lethal dart gun they carried for self-defense against potential squatters, but he knew it would be useless here. "It's trying to separate us," Michael said, his voice low and urgent, trying to project an authority he no longer felt. Stay together. No matter what, we stay together. As if in direct defiance of his command, a sudden powerful gust of wind roared through the enclosed space, though there were no open windows or doors. It was an unnatural wind, carrying with it the stench of stagnant water and something metallic like old blood. The force of it threw them off balance, slamming them against the grimy walls. The impact was jarring. Michael felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as he hit the brickwork. His flashlight flew from his hand, skittering across the floor and rolling into a dark crevice, its beam extinguished. He was plunged back into darkness, a cold, suffocating black that swallowed sound and light alike. "Jessica! David! Emily! Say something!" he yelled, his voice raw with panic. Only silence answered him, a silence that was far more terrifying than any scream. He fumbled blindly, his hands scraping against rough plaster and unseen debris. Every nerve ending screamed at him to run, to flee, but in what direction? He was utterly lost, utterly alone. Then a faint, rhythmic scratching began, close by, just beyond where his flashlight had disappeared. Asterisk scratch. 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 Asterisk. It was the sound of fingernails dragging across stone, slow and deliberate, a sound that promised unimaginable torment. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. Meanwhile, Jessica found herself disoriented, her head spinning from the impact. Her own flashlight, though still in her hand, cast a wavering beam across a hallway she didn't recognize. The walls were covered in faded, childish drawings, stick figures with vacant eyes, grotesque smiles, and long, spindly limbs. It was a children's ward, a place they hadn't yet explored. How had she gotten here? She had been right next to Michael just moments ago. A faint, childish giggle echoed from the end of the corridor, a sound that was sweet and innocent, yet utterly chilling in this context. Jessica's blood ran cold. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her gut that there were no living children in this asylum. Her flashlight beam trembled as she slowly, cautiously, walked towards the source of the sound. Each step felt like wading through treacle, the air growing heavier, colder. The giggling grew louder, morphing into a series of distorted whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was playful, mischievous, and deeply unsettling. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely a whisper, a desperate plea into the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a small wooden rocking horse, covered in dust and cobwebs, began to rock gently at the end of the hallway, its runners creaking rhythmically against the floorboards. There was no breeze, no visible force. It simply rocked back and forth, as if an invisible child had just dismounted. A faint, sweet smell like old lavender and something sickly sweet filled the air. Jessica's mind screamed for her to turn and run, but she felt a strange, compelling pull towards the rocking horse. As she approached it, her flashlight beam illuminated a small, tattered doll lying on the floor beside it. Its porcelain face was cracked, one glass eye missing, and its dress was stained with what looked like dried blood. As her light fell upon it, the doll's remaining glass eye seemed to fixate on her, a vacant, unnerving stare. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, the doll's head tilted to the side, a soft, almost inaudible creak accompanying the movement. A thin, reedy whisper, barely audible, seemed to emanate directly from the doll itself. "Play with me." Jessica let out a choked cry, dropping her flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly before settling on the doll, which now lay perfectly still, its head no longer tilted. The giggling had stopped. The rocking horse was still. But the feeling of being watched, of being preyed upon, was overwhelming. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her mind screaming for an escape from this twisted nursery. Meanwhile, David found himself in a cavernous, tiled room, a place he immediately recognized from his research as the hydrotherapy ward. The room was dominated by several large, rusted metal tubs, their surfaces stained with years of grime and decay. Water, black and stagnant, filled one of them to the brim, a thick, oily sheen on its surface. The air here was damp and chilling, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron and something else, something fetid and deeply disturbing. His flashlight, miraculously still working, cast long, distorted shadows that danced like tormented figures across the high ceilings. He tried to call out for Michael, Jessica, or Emily, but his voice caught in his throat, a dry, choked sound. His comms unit was dead, the earpiece emitting only static. He was truly alone. A low guttural gurgle emanated from the stagnant water in the largest tub. David froze, his flashlight beam fixed on its surface. Tiny ripples disturbed the oily film, spreading outwards from the center. He stood rooted to the spot, his breath held captive in his lungs, his muscles screaming for him to move. Then a pale, emaciated hand, impossibly long and skeletal, slowly rose from the black water. It was dripping wet, its skin mottled and decaying, fingernails long and yellowed. It reached towards him, fingers slowly curling, beckoning. A low, mournful moan, filled with an ancient sorrow, seemed to rise from the tub itself. David let out a strangled scream, stumbling backward, tripping over something unseen and falling hard onto the cold, tiled floor. His flashlight clattered away, rolling into a dark corner, leaving him in near total darkness. The hand, still reaching, seemed to grow larger, its form becoming more defined, as if the water itself was coalescing into a grotesque parody of a human figure. The gurgling intensified, the sound of water filling decaying lungs. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, desperate to escape, his mind reeling. Was this real? Was he hallucinating? The asylum was twisting his perceptions, feeding on his fear. He felt a cold, clammy touch on his ankle. A gasp tore from his throat as he kicked out wildly, scrambling further into the darkness, away from the unseen horror that had reached for him from the depths of the hydrotherapy tub. The mournful moan followed him, echoing the despair of countless souls trapped within these walls. And Emily, the most sensitive among them, found herself not in a physical space, but adrift in a terrifying, vivid hallucination. She was back in her childhood home, but everything was wrong. The colors were muted, the air thick with an oppressive silence. Her parents sat at the dinner table, their backs to her, silent, unmoving. She tried to call out to them, but no sound escaped her lips. A sudden sharp pain lanced through her head, a familiar sensation, a psychic overload. She saw fleeting images, a young woman strapped to a bed, her eyes wide with terror, a doctor with a cold, impassive gaze holding a syringe, a shadowy figure lurking in the corners of her vision, its presence radiating pure malice. Then, the silence in her hallucination shattered. Her parents slowly turned their heads, their faces a grotesque parody of their normal selves. Their eyes were black, empty sockets, and their mouths were stretched into wide, silent screams. Blood, impossibly red, began to seep from their eyes and mouths, dripping onto the pristine white tablecloth. "You're next," a chorus of unseen voices whispered. All around her, inside her head, 1,000 fragmented voices coalescing into one malevolent entity. "You'll never leave. You'll join us." Emily collapsed, her body racked with tremors, her mind screaming in silent agony. The asylum wasn't just hunting them. It was tearing them apart, twisting their realities, feeding on their deepest fears one by one. It was a predator, and they were its prey, scattered and vulnerable, each facing their own personal hell, isolated in the heart of the cursed institution. The hunt had truly begun, and the asylum was savoring every moment of their terror. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, a ragged, desperate sound swallowed by the suffocating silence that had replaced the cacophony of fear. The EMF detector, still clutched in her trembling hand, shrieked, its red lights blazing like a furious warning. It wasn't just spiking. It was screaming, a sustained, impossible surge of electromagnetic energy that pulsed with a malevolent rhythm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming pressure in the air. This wasn't a ghost. This was a force, a palpable presence that pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, dissecting her with an unseen gaze. She stumbled backward, her gaze darting wildly around the desolate corridor. The shadows, once just shadows, now seemed to writhe and stretch, becoming distorted caricatures of human forms. The air grew impossibly cold, a bone-deep chill that seeped into her very marrow, stealing her warmth and her courage. A whisper, thin and reedy, brushed past her ear, too indistinct to form words, yet clear enough to convey a single terrifying message: "You are not welcome." Panic, raw and unthinking, seized her. She spun, desperate to find an escape, any escape. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, each door identical, each window a black, unforgiving void. She ran, her feet pounding a frantic rhythm on the dusty floorboards, the EMF detector still wailing in her hand, a constant siren of impending doom. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier, thicker, as if the very asylum was breathing down her neck. Suddenly, a faint guttural scratching sound echoed from behind one of the closed doors she was passing. It wasn't human, not quite. More like something dragging heavy claws across ancient wood. A slow, deliberate scrape that spoke of immense strength and malicious intent. Sarah didn't pause, she couldn't. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air. But the primal urge to flee was all that mattered. She burst through a doorway, blindly hoping for an exit, and found herself in what looked like an old patient ward. Rows of rusted metal bed frames standing like skeletal sentinels in the gloom. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound itself. It was the silence of a predator that had paused, observing its prey, deciding its next move. Sarah pressed herself against the cold, damp wall, trying to regulate her ragged breathing. Her eyes scanned the empty ward, the decaying mattresses, the peeling paint. Nothing. But the EMF detector continued its relentless shriek, pointing directly at the far end of the ward, where a single closed door stood ominous and dark. Then a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the light. A shadow, deeper than the others, detached itself from the wall near that door. It wasn't solid, not a person, but a fluid, amorphous mass that seemed to pulse with an inner darkness. It began to drift slowly, silently across the ward, not towards her, but around her, as if hurting her, cutting off any potential escape route. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones. It wasn't just chasing her. It was playing with her. Meanwhile, miles away in the twisted labyrinth of the asylum, Michael was fighting a different kind of battle. The sudden violent disruption had thrown him off balance, both literally and figuratively. His comms were dead, the static a mocking reminder of their isolation. He tried calling out to Jessica, to David, to Emily, to Sarah, but only the hollow echo of his own voice returned. The silence that followed his frantic shouts was absolute, unnerving. He gripped his thermal camera, swinging it around the vast, empty cafeteria he found himself in. The room was a graveyard of overturned tables and broken chairs, a testament to a forgotten chaos. On the thermal display, the room glowed in shades of blue and green, indicating ambient temperatures. But then a flicker, a sudden, intense burst of orange, then red, blooming violently in the center of the room, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. A cold spot. No, not a cold spot. A heat spot. An impossible, instantaneous surge of heat, gone in a blink. Michael narrowed his eyes, his mind racing. This wasn't a trick of the light, or a faulty sensor. This was something active, something manipulating the very fabric of their reality. He moved cautiously, his heavy boots crunching on bits of plaster and glass. He knew the asylum was notorious for its rapid temperature fluctuations, but this was different. This was deliberate. He called out again, his voice strained. "Anyone? Respond. Team report." Only the silence answered, thick and heavy, pressing down on him. A low hum started to vibrate through the floor beneath his feet, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, like a vast, unseen heart beating deep within the earth. The entire structure seemed to groan around him, a mournful, ancient sound that sent a shiver down his spine. He checked his Geiger counter. Nothing. No radiation spikes. But the air felt charged, heavy with an unseen energy. He pulled out his spirit box, a device designed to scan through radio frequencies, hoping to pick up any intelligible words amidst the white noise. He clicked it on, and the chaotic hiss and crackle filled the air. For a moment it was just static. Then a fractured voice, thin and distorted, broke through the cacophony. "Lost, so lost." Michael froze, straining to hear. The voice was faint, barely there, like a ghost of a whisper across a vast distance. Was it one of them? Or was it something else, something trapped within the asylum itself? "Who is this?" Michael demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Identify yourself." The static intensified, then another fragmented word emerged, clearer this time, chillingly precise. "Pray." The spirit box went dead, abruptly cutting off the terrifying message. Michael stared at the device, his heart pounding. "Pray." The word echoed Sarah's earlier premonition. He wasn't just investigating a haunting. He was caught in a hunt. He moved towards a door, attempting to open it, but it was jammed, rusted shut. He tried another and then another. Every exit from the cafeteria was sealed. as if the asylum itself had decided to trap him. The heavy metal doors, once merely old, now felt like impenetrable barriers, forged by an unseen hand. He was trapped, just like Sarah, just like the others. A low, mocking chuckle seemed to ripple through the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a human sound, not truly. It had a hollow, echoing quality, like laughter from an empty tomb, filled with an ancient, knowing malice. It was the sound of the asylum, savoring its victory, reveling in their terror. Michael gripped his flashlight, its beam a weak defiance against the overwhelming darkness. He knew with a sickening certainty that they had stumbled into something far greater, far more malevolent than any ghost story or urban legend. This wasn't a place with a haunting. This place was the haunting, and it was awake. It was aware, and it wanted them. All of them. He had to get out, had to find his team. But the asylum had other plans. The very walls around him seemed to pulse, to breathe, to shift with an unseen life. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else. Something metallic and acrid like old blood. The temperature plummeted again, sending shivers through his body that had nothing to do with the cold. A shadow detached itself from a far corner, not drifting like the one Sarah saw, but solidifying. It was taller than a man, gaunt, with an impossibly long skeletal arm reaching out, not towards him, but towards the spectral heat signature that had briefly appeared on his thermal camera. It was reaching for something that wasn't there, something that had been violently ripped from this place. And then it turned its head, or where a head should have been. Two pinpricks of light like malevolent embers glowed deep within its formless mass, fixing on Michael with an ancient, hungry stare. He felt a primal scream build in his throat, but it was trapped, suffocated by the sheer terror. This was not a residual haunting. This was an entity, a guardian, a predator, and it had just seen him. The hunt was no longer just beginning. It was at his doorstep, its hungry gaze fixed firmly on its next victim. The asylum was alive, and it was closing in. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, suffocating silence. Every nerve ending screamed, not with the cold dread of a typical haunting, but with the primal terror of being prey. He wasn't just observing, he was seen. The air in the corridor, already frigid, plummeted further, stinging his lungs with each ragged breath. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound he felt more than heard, resonating deep in his bones. He knew with an absolute certainty that chilled him to his core, that the glowing eyes, those abyssal points of light, belonged to something ancient, something that had presided over these decaying halls for decades, perhaps centuries. This wasn't a lost soul. It was a territorial predator, and he had just trespassed into its hunting grounds. He stumbled backward, not daring to turn his back on the space where the eyes had been. The shadows in the corners of the corridor seemed to deepen, to stretch and writhe, forming indistinct shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. He could feel its presence, a crushing weight that pressed in from all sides, whispering his name in the guttural language of fear. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly, but a cacophony of distorted whispers, like 1,000 dying breaths echoing through a hollow chamber. He could almost hear the faint, sickening click of something unseen, something sharp, just behind the veil of his perception. He had to move, had to get out, but his limbs felt heavy, anchored by an invisible force. Then a low guttural growl ripped through the oppressive silence, rattling the loose plaster from the ceiling. It wasn't the sound of an animal, but something far worse, a sound born of pure malice and ancient hunger. Michael finally broke free of his paralysis, spinning and sprinting down the corridor, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the vast emptiness. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape it. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam dancing wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of peeling wallpaper, rusted gurneys, and empty wheelchairs that seemed to watch him pass. Each shadow held a potential threat, each distant creak a sign of pursuit. He could feel it behind him, a cold breath on his neck, the distinct sensation of being followed, not just by a presence but by something that moved with deliberate, terrifying speed. Meanwhile, in a different wing, Jessica and David were navigating a labyrinth of patient rooms, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air around them was heavy with the smell of decay and something metallic, like old blood. They had been calling out for Emily for what felt like hours, their voices growing hoarser, their hope dwindling with each unanswered shout. The asylum's silence, once merely eerie, had become an oppressive, living thing, punctuated only by their own ragged breathing and the distant, unidentifiable groans that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Emily!" Jessica called out again, her voice cracking with strain. "Emily, where are you?" David gripped her arm, his face pale in the bobbing beam of his light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "Hear what?" Jessica strained her ears, but only heard the thumping of her own heart. That wasn't us," David insisted, pointing his light down a long, narrow corridor lined with what looked like cells. It was like a scream. Faint, but definitely a scream. A cold knot formed in Jessica's stomach. Emily had been exploring this area. "Michael," she murmured, a new wave of fear washing over her. What if it was Michael? They pressed on, their pace quickening, drawn by the desperate hope that they might find one of their friends. The corridor David had pointed to seemed to stretch endlessly, each cell door a rusted, ominous barrier. As they passed one particular cell, a low guttural sound, like a choked sob, emanated from within. Both of them froze, their flashlights converging on the tiny, barred window of the cell door. "Hello," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is anyone in there?" Silence. Then a faint scratching sound like fingernails dragging across concrete came from inside. It was a rhythmic, agonizing sound, punctuated by soft, desperate whimpers. David slowly reached for the heavy iron handle, his hand trembling. The metal was icy cold, despite the clammy heat of the room. He pushed, but the door was locked, sealed shut by decades of rust and disuse. "Stand back," David muttered, bracing himself. He kicked at the door once, twice, the heavy thud echoing mockingly through the silent wing. It didn't budge. He tried the handle again, pulling with all his might, but it was useless. As they stood there, frustrated and terrified, a chilling whisper slithered out from beneath the door, curling around their ankles like an icy mist. It was a woman's voice, broken and despairing, repeating a single horrifying phrase. "He won't let me leave. He won't let me leave." Jessica gasped, stumbling backward. "Who won't let you leave?" she cried out, her voice trembling. The scratching intensified, becoming more frantic, more desperate. Then, with a sudden sickening crack, something slammed against the inside of the door, causing a fine spray of dust and rust to erupt from the ancient metal. The whimpering stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that resonated with the same primal malice Michael had just encountered. It was the same sound, but closer, more immediate, and far more terrifying. "We need to go, Jessica, now!" David yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the cell. They ran, their footsteps pounding a frantic rhythm against the grimy floor. The growl chasing them, seeming to multiply and echo from every direction. They burst out of the cell wing and into a wider, central hall, momentarily disoriented. Their flashlights swept across an area they hadn't explored yet. This part of the asylum was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt preserved. There were old medical instruments neatly arranged on a rusted cart, faded charts still pinned to a corkboard, and a single ancient wheelchair positioned perfectly in the center of the hall, facing them. As their lights fell upon the wheelchair, a figure materialized in it. It wasn't a clear, solid form, but a shimmering, translucent outline of a person, sitting upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was a woman, her hair long and dark, spilling over her shoulders, her spectral hands gripping the armrests. Her eyes, though indistinct, seemed to bore into them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. "Emily," Jessica whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure in the wheelchair was roughly Emily's size, and the dark hair was similar, but there was something terribly wrong. The head was twisted too far, and the way it sat was too stiff, too lifeless even for a ghost. As they stared, horrified, the figure slowly, agonizingly began to turn its head. The motion was jerky, unnatural, accompanied by a faint, sickening creak that seemed to emanate from the very air around it. When its face finally turned towards them, it was not Emily. It was a visage of pure agony and despair, a face contorted in a silent scream, its mouth open in a gaping maw, its spectral eyes wide and vacant. But what truly horrified them was the distinct dark stain that spread across its chest, exactly where a heart would be, and the faint, shimmering outline of a surgical scalpel protruding from it. Then, from the lap of the spectral figure, a small, familiar object tumbled to the floor with a soft clink. It was Emily's digital voice recorder, still blinking with a faint red light, indicating it was recording. David scrambled forward, his fear momentarily overridden by a desperate need for answers. He snatched it up, his fingers fumbling with the playback button. A cacophony of distorted whispers and static erupted from the device, followed by Emily's terrified voice, muffled but unmistakable. "No, no, please. Get away from me. What are you doing? Let go. Michael. David. Jessica." Her voice was raw with terror, punctuated by gasps and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Then a new voice, low and guttural, completely devoid of humanity, cut through the static, addressing Emily directly. It was the same growl they had heard from the cell, the same growl Michael had heard. "You shouldn't have come here. You sought the whispers, now you will join them. You sought the forgotten, now you will be forgotten. You sought the truth, and the truth is, he never left." A blood-curdling scream tore through the recorder, abruptly cut short by a sickening wet thud. The red light on the recorder flickered once, then went out completely. The spectral figure in the wheelchair remained, its head now facing them directly, its vacant eyes seeming to hold all the sorrow and horror of 100 years. The dark stain on its chest seemed to deepen, to pulse with an unholy light. Jessica collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Emily. Oh God, Emily." David stood frozen, the dead recorder clutched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the spectral figure. The entity had spoken of him, of someone who never left. Who was he? And what had he done to Emily? The asylum wasn't just haunted by patients or doctors. It was governed by a singular, malevolent force, a presence so ancient and powerful, it could manifest and manipulate with terrifying ease. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been consumed, absorbed into the very fabric of the asylum's suffering, a new addition to its endless gallery of torment. The spectral figure in the wheelchair wasn't just a ghost. It was a warning, a horrifying tableau of what awaited them. The asylum wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had just tasted blood. It was a trap meticulously designed, and they were caught within its iron grip with no escape. The game had changed from a hunt to a gruesome sacrifice, and Emily had been the first offering. A guttural scream abruptly cut short, echoed through the cavernous ward, followed by a sickening thud that reverberated in their very bones. Then an absolute profound silence that was far more terrifying than any scream. Michael, David, and Jessica stood frozen, their flashlights dancing wildly, illuminating empty space where Emily had just been. Her camera, left on the floor, still recorded, but all it showed was a blurred image of the ceiling before the light died. Emily was gone. Just like that. Panic, raw and visceral, clawed at Jessica's throat. She stumbled backward, bumping into David, who was already shaking uncontrollably. "Emily? Emily!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "No, no, no!" Michael, his face ashen, forced himself to move, sweeping his flashlight across the sterile, blood-splattered floor. A dark, viscous smear like crude oil glistened under his beam, leading to the shattered window. But there was no body, no sign of struggle beyond that single horrifying impact. It was as if she had been absorbed, pulled into the very fabric of the building's despair. She's gone," David stammered, tears streaming down his face, illuminated by the faint glow of his own malfunctioning EMF meter, which was now screaming at its highest possible frequency. The device, usually a tool of investigation, now just a shrieking testament to their doom. "No!" Michael roared, a desperate, animalistic sound. He ran to the window, peering out into the inky blackness. Nothing. Only the gnarled branches of ancient trees swaying in the wind, their shadows dancing like skeletal fingers. "Emily!" he screamed again, his voice hoarse, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the asylum. There was no response, no echo, no sign of life. The air grew impossibly colder, a chill that sank deep into their bones, not just from the night, but from something ancient and malevolent. It felt like the very walls were breathing, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale that vibrated through the floor. The faint, rhythmic thump-thump they had heard earlier, which they dismissed as the building settling, now intensified, sounding like a colossal, dying heart beating somewhere deep beneath them. "We have to get out of here," Jessica whimpered, grabbing Michael's arm, her nails digging in. "This isn't a ghost. This is something else. Something alive." Michael nodded, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible. Emily, the most level-headed, the most pragmatic of them, simply vanished. Not dragged away, not attacked by a tangible threat, but gone. It was a clean, brutal abduction, executed with surgical precision, leaving only terror in its wake. "You're right," Michael said, his voice strained. "We're not hunting. We're being hunted. We need to find a way out. Now." They turned, ready to retrace their steps, but the hallway behind them, moments ago dimly lit by their combined flashlights, was now plunged into complete darkness. Their beams, powerful as they were, couldn't penetrate the void. It was an absolute, consuming blackness, not just the absence of light, but an active, suffocating presence. "My flashlight, it's dead," David whispered, fumbling with his device. Jessica's flickered once, twice, then died, leaving only Michael's single beam to cut through the oppressive gloom. The air grew thick, heavy like breathing underwater. Then came the whispers. Not the indistinct murmurs they had recorded before, but clear, distinct voices, emanating from the darkness. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They swirled around them, an overlapping cacophony of agony, despair, and chilling glee. "Lost, so lost. The pain never ends. One by one, you'll join us," she screamed so sweetly. The voices were everywhere, pressing in on them, each one a shard of ice piercing their sanity. Jessica clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, a silent scream trapped in her throat. David collapsed to his knees, rocking back and forth, muttering, "No, no, no." Michael, despite his own terror, knew they couldn't break. He had to lead them out. He swung his flashlight wildly, trying to find an exit, any sign of their path back. But the hallway seemed to have stretched, distorted, the familiar landmarks gone. The doors they had passed, once cracked open, were now all uniformly closed, indistinguishable from one another, like a macabre, endless corridor of identical cell doors. "Stay together," Michael yelled, his voice barely audible above the rising tide of whispers. He grabbed David, hauling him to his feet. "We need to find the main stairwell. Follow me. Stick close." He pushed forward, his single flashlight beam struggling against the encroaching darkness. Every step felt like wading through thick mud. The whispers intensified, now mixed with the sound of shuffling feet, dragging, slithering noises emanating from the unseen depths of the hall. He could feel cold breaths on his neck, phantom hands brushing against his skin. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible creak came from directly behind them. Michael spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, but the sound was distinct. It was the sound of a gurney wheel slowly turning. Then a low, guttural growl, not human, not animal, but something ancient and predatory, emanated from the darkness to their left. It was the sound of something expecting them. They moved faster, a frantic, stumbling run, Michael half-dragging David, Jessica clinging to Michael's jacket. The asylum was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous labyrinth designed to trap and consume. The walls seemed to shift, the floorboards groaned under their feet, and the air itself felt heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. They reached what Michael hoped was the intersection leading to the main stairwell. He swept his light across the junction, revealing 3 identical corridors, each disappearing into the same absolute darkness. There were no signs, no distinguishing features. It was a cruel, impossible choice. "Which way?" Jessica gasped, her voice raw with fear. Michael stared, his heart pounding against his ribs. He remembered a faint inscription on the wall near the main stairs, a faded mural from the asylum's early days. He searched desperately, his flashlight beam dancing across the grimy plaster, but all he saw was peeling paint and shadow. Then, from the corridor to their right, a sound. Not a whisper, not a growl, but a familiar faint click. It was the sound of Emily's camera, the one she always used to activate its night vision. "Emily," Michael whispered, hope, fragile and dangerous, blooming in his chest. Could she still be alive? Had the entity simply incapacitated her, keeping her somewhere, a macabre trophy? He took a step towards the sound, his heart leaping. Jessica pulled him back, her eyes wide with terror. "No, Michael. It's a trick. It has to be." But the sound came again, clearer this time. Click, followed by a faint, desperate cough. It sounded undeniably like Emily. "She's in there," Michael insisted, pulling free from Jessica's grasp. He had to know. He couldn't abandon her. He was the leader. He had to save his team. He plunged into the right corridor, his flashlight beam piercing the darkness, calling out, "Emily, we're here." David and Jessica hesitated for a moment, then, driven by a desperate hope and the terrifying alternative of being left alone, followed him into the echoing blackness. As soon as all three of them crossed the threshold, a sickening thump echoed behind them. They spun around, but the corridor they had just entered from was gone, replaced by a solid, unyielding wall of darkness. They were trapped, and from somewhere deeper within the corridor, a chilling, distorted voice, unmistakably Emily's, began to sing a child's lullaby, off-key and laced with an inhuman, predatory glee. The lullaby was a grotesque mockery, a sound that twisted the innocence of childhood into something profoundly evil. Michael and David froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs, each beat echoing the horrific truth. It wasn't just Emily's voice. It was her voice, yet utterly alien, stripped of all humanity. The playful melody became a dirge, each note a nail hammered into their sanity. David, ever the pragmatist, was the first to react, his voice a raw whisper. "Emily? What? What are you doing?" He tried to move towards the sound, but Michael grabbed his arm, pulling him back with surprising force. "No, David. That's not her. Not anymore." Michael's eyes darted around the suffocating darkness, searching for any flicker of light, any sign of a way out. The wall behind them was absolute, a void that swallowed all hope. He pressed his palm against it, feeling only the cold, smooth, impenetrable surface. It wasn't a door, wasn't a trick of the light. It was a solid living void. The lullaby crescendoed, then abruptly cut off, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath their feet. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure, a predator savoring its prey. "She's playing with us," David breathed, the color draining from his face. The reality of their situation, stark and brutal, settled upon them. They weren't just trapped by a collapsed wall. They were trapped by something that had taken Emily, and now it was their turn. A faint, sickly green glow shimmered into existence at the far end of the corridor, illuminating a figure. It was Emily, or what was left of her. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her long dark hair falling across her face, obscuring all but one eye. That eye, usually warm and full of life, was now a bottomless well of malevolence, reflecting the eerie light with a disturbing intensity. Her lips were stretched into a wide, unnatural smile, revealing too many teeth, too sharp, too white. She wore her usual expedition gear, but it hung on her like a shroud, devoid of the vibrant energy she usually exuded. "Emily," Michael whispered, a desperate plea. He took a hesitant step forward, but the air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, radiating an ancient, suffocating cold. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched them, its single visible eye burning into their very souls. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand. Its fingers, once graceful and agile, were now elongated, skeletal, tipped with nails that looked like obsidian shards. It pointed a single finger directly at Michael, and a voice, no longer Emily's but a chorus of whispers, ancient and legion, slithered through the air, merging into a single cohesive thought. "Asterisk, you came for us. Now you belong to us." Asterisk. A chilling wave of understanding washed over Michael. This wasn't just a ghost. It was an amalgamation, a collective of tormented souls, perhaps the very patients and staff who had suffered and died within these walls, bound together by something far older and darker. And it had found a new vessel in Emily. Suddenly, the green light intensified, and the corridor began to ripple, distorting the walls, the floor, everything. Images flickered into existence around them. Spectral figures in antiquated asylum attire, their faces contorted in silent screams, their hands reaching out in an eternal plea. They were not solid but impressions, echoes of pain projected by the entity. "It's showing us their memories," David murmured, his eyes wide with horror, yet a strange, morbid fascination. "It wants us to feel what they felt." The whispers intensified, filling their minds, not just their ears. They heard the cries of children, the desperate pleas of the sane trapped amongst the mad, the chilling laughter of sadistic orderlies, the metallic clatter of instruments, the agonizing silence of solitary confinement. It was a symphony of suffering, played directly into their consciousness. Michael clutched his head, trying to block out the onslaught, but it was useless. The terror wasn't just external. It was internal, burrowing deep into his mind, attacking his very sense of self. He saw flashes of Emily's face, her true face, contorted in agony, struggling against the entity's control. She was still in there, somewhere, a prisoner in her own body. "It's trying to break us," he gasped, his voice strained. "It wants to wear us down, make us susceptible." The Emily figure took a step forward, then another, moving with an unnatural, gliding motion. Each step brought her closer, and with her the crushing weight of despair intensified. The spectral figures around them seemed to solidify, their vacant eyes fixed on Michael and David, drawing closer, their silent screams palpable. David stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, and fell to the floor. He scrambled back, his eyes fixed on the approaching horror. "What does it want, Michael? Why us?" The chorus of whispers answered, a guttural, insidious response that resonated deep within their bones. Asterisk new life. New vessels. This place hungers. It always hungers, asterisk. Michael felt a cold dread settle deep in his stomach. Vessels. That was it. This entity didn't just want to torment them. It wanted to possess them, to add their consciousness, their very souls to its collective, just as it had done with Emily. The ghost hunters who never returned weren't just victims. They were recruits, unwilling hosts for this ancient, malevolent force. He looked at Emily's distorted face, and a new wave of resolve, born of terror and a fierce loyalty, surged through him. He wouldn't let it take them. He wouldn't let Emily be consumed entirely. There had to be a way. He remembered the journal, the cryptic warnings, the strange symbols. The entity was powerful, but it wasn't omnipotent. It had rules, patterns, fed on fear, on despair, on the erosion of will. "Don't give in, David," Michael yelled, his voice cracking but firm. "Don't let it break you. It wants your fear." The Emily figure stopped, perhaps surprised by Michael's defiance. Its head cocked again, an almost curious gesture. The chorus of whispers momentarily faltered, then returned with renewed fury, a cacophony of rage and frustration. The spectral figures lunged forward, their ethereal hands phasing through Michael and David, leaving behind an unbearable coldness, a feeling of utter desolation. Michael fought against the internal assault, focusing on a single memory. Emily's laugh, bright and genuine, from their first successful investigation. He clung to it, a lifeline in the sea of despair. He knew that the entity fed on their negative emotions, and if they could resist, even for a moment, it might create an opening. He looked at the wall of darkness behind them again. It was solid, but what was it? Not physical matter. A manifestation of the entity's power, perhaps. A psychological barrier made real. If they could break its hold on their minds, could they break its hold on their reality? The journal, Michael shouted, his mind racing. It said something about the heart of the asylum, the source of its power. He remembered the old legends, the stories of places where the veil between worlds was thin, where ancient evils could fester. This asylum wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, a feeding ground, and the entity was its warden. The Emily figure began to laugh again. A sound that was both Emily's and something ancient and monstrous. A sound that promised eternal torment. The green light pulsed violently, and the spectral figures around them coalesced, their forms becoming denser, more definable, their silent screams now a low, mournful moan that reverberated through the corridor. "It's protecting its core," David gasped, struggling to his feet. "If we find the heart, maybe we can sever its connection to this place, to Emily." But where was the heart? The asylum was a labyrinth, and they were trapped, with a monstrous Emily figure blocking the only apparent path forward. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the cacophony of whispers and moans. A faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump, like a slow, heavy heartbeat, coming from deeper within the darkness, beyond the Emily figure. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but distinct. The entity, through Emily's form, seemed to react to the sound. Its head snapped towards the source of the beat, its malevolent eye narrowing. A flicker of something akin to annoyance, or perhaps even fear, crossed its distorted features. It was a fleeting expression, quickly replaced by its usual predatory glee, but Michael saw it. The entity had a weakness. That sound. Michael pointed a trembling finger past the Emily figure. "That's it. That's the heart. It's trying to hide it, protect it." The Emily figure let out a shriek, a sound that was both human and inhuman, a wail of fury and defiance. The green light around her flared blindingly, momentarily obscuring everything. When their vision cleared, the spectral figures were gone, dissolved back into the shadows. Only Emily remained, but she was different now. Her form was no longer shadowy or ethereal. She was solid, real, and radiating an immense, palpable power. Her eyes, both of them now visible, were glowing emeralds, burning with an unholy light. Her smile was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure hatred. "You will not go further." The chorus of voices hissed through her lips, each word a venomous dart. "You will join us, both of you, forever." And then, with a speed that defied human comprehension, the Emily figure lunged. Not at Michael, not at David, but directly at the wall of darkness behind them. Her long skeletal fingers slammed against the impenetrable void, and with a sound like tearing fabric, a small jagged crack appeared in the solid blackness. Through the crack they saw a glimpse of what lay beyond. A vast, cavernous space, pulsating with a sickly reddish-black light, and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump grew louder, more insistent, more terrifying. The wall wasn't just a barrier. It was a seal, holding something back, and the entity in its rage had just begun to tear it open. It wasn't trying to keep them in, it was trying to keep something else from getting out. Or perhaps it was trying to unleash something even worse. The asylum was more than just a place of torment. It was a cage, and the entity was merely one of its more powerful inhabitants, or perhaps even its jailer, now compromised by its rage. The crack widened, emitting a wave of foul, metallic air that made their eyes water and their throats burn. The rhythmic thumping intensified, becoming a furious, deafening beat, a primal rhythm that vibrated through their very bones, threatening to shatter them from within. Michael and David stood frozen, caught between the terrifying, possessed form of their friend and the unspeakable horror that was now being unleashed from behind the wall. The asylum was waking up, and whatever lay beyond that fractured seal was far more ancient, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. The game had changed. They weren't just targets anymore. They were caught in a far larger, far more horrific conflict. And the true nature of the asylum's heart was about to be revealed. The true nature of the asylum's heart was about to be revealed. It wasn't a spectral being or a monstrous creature in the traditional sense, but something far more insidious, far more fundamental to the fabric of reality itself. What they had perceived as the asylum's heart was a pulsating, non-physical singularity, a void that defied conventional understanding. It was a nexus of pure, concentrated despair, amplified by decades of suffering, fear, and Dr. Thorne's horrific experiments. This wasn't merely a place where spirits lingered. It was a cosmic wound, a tear in the veil between dimensions, actively feeding on the emotional residue of human existence. Jessica, her EMF reader now useless, felt a cold dread that transcended fear. It was the primal terror of facing something utterly alien, something that didn't just want to scare them, but to unmake them. The air around them grew heavy, not with the chill of a cold spot, but with an oppressive psychic weight that threatened to crush them. The shadows in the boiler room seemed to deepen, to coil and writhe with an impossible darkness, not just an absence of light, but an active, consuming presence. Michael, his hand instinctively going to his forgotten camera, felt a surge of nausea. The rational part of his brain screamed for an explanation, for a scientific anomaly he could document. But this was beyond science. It was an anti-existence, a hunger made manifest. The flickering lights in the room began to strobe erratically, illuminating grotesque, fleeting images on the walls, contorted faces, skeletal hands reaching, impossible geometries that defied logic. These weren't residual hauntings, they were echoes of souls being devoured, twisted into a horrifying tableau by the asylum's true nature. David, ever the pragmatist, was the first to articulate the terrifying truth. "It's not a ghost," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "It's a drain, a funnel. It's been pulling everything in right from the start. All the suffering, all the death. It's been condensing it, empowering itself." Emily, clutching the journal like a lifeline, remembered Thorne's cryptic notes about the convergence and the ultimate energy source. He hadn't just been experimenting on the patients. He had been experimenting with the very fabric of their agony, trying to harness this monstrous nexus. He hadn't created the drain, but he had discovered it, perhaps even fed it, in his insane quest for immortality or ultimate power. The ghosts they had encountered, the weeping woman, the screaming child, the faceless doctor, they weren't individual entities with grievances. They were merely the manifestations of the drain's influence, the fragmented echoes of those it had consumed, used as puppets to draw in new prey. And then Mark spoke, his voice surprisingly calm, though laced with a profound weariness. "It's not just the asylum anymore. It's growing. It's trying to break free." He pointed to a section of the wall where the darkness seemed particularly dense, almost liquid. Thorne's last experiment wasn't about containing it. It was about releasing it. He thought he could control it, direct its power. He opened the floodgates, and now it's trying to spread beyond these walls. A low hum began to vibrate through the boiler room, not from the dormant machinery, but from the very air itself. It was a sound that seemed to resonate deep within their bones, a discordant, soul-shaking frequency that threatened to unravel their sanity. The shadows pulsed in time with it, expanding and contracting like a monstrous, invisible heart. Michael finally understood the larger conflict. This wasn't just about a few ghost hunters in a haunted building. This was about something trying to breach into their reality, something that, if unleashed, could consume entire cities, entire populations. The asylum wasn't just a prison for lost souls. It was a containment field, and Thorne, in his hubris, had almost shattered it. Suddenly, the fragmented manifestations grew bolder. The weeping woman appeared directly in front of Jessica, her face contorted in a silent scream, her form more solid, more horrific than before. Her hands, skeletal and grasping, reached out, and Jessica felt a bone-deep chill, a sense of her very essence being drained away. She recoiled, a gasp caught in her throat, feeling the psychic intrusion like a physical assault. The screaming child materialized next to Emily, its mouth open in an impossible shriek that, though silent, echoed deafeningly in Emily's mind. The child's eyes, empty black pits, stared into her, and Emily felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror, the kind that paralyzes. She knew with chilling certainty that if it touched her, her memories, her very identity would be ripped away. David found himself surrounded by the faceless doctor, its shadowy form pressing in from all sides. He could feel the cold, clinical malice emanating from it, a desire not just to hurt, but to dissect, to analyze, to understand him by tearing him apart. He lashed out, blindly, his fists connecting with nothing but frigid air, yet the sensation of being trapped, dissected, intensified. Michael, caught in the center, saw the entire room warp and distort. The flickering lights became a blinding, disorienting strobe. The concrete walls seemed to melt and reform into grotesque, shifting visages of suffering. He felt a profound sense of loss, a wave of collective despair washing over him, threatening to drown his own will, his own self. This was the drain's true power, not just to manifest fear, but to become fear, to become despair, to overwhelm and absorb. Mark, however, remained strangely focused. He looked not at the manifestations, but at the pulsing darkness on the wall, the source. "It's feeding on us," he stated, his voice strained but clear. "Our fear, our confusion. It's making it stronger. We have to shut it down. If Thorne could open it, there has to be a way to close it." Emily, still clutching the journal, suddenly spotted a diagram she had overlooked. It was a complex array of symbols, geometric patterns, and what looked like a sequence of actions. "The crucible," she whispered, her eyes wide with dawning horror and understanding. Thorne called this chamber the crucible. He didn't just open the drain. He designed a way to control it, to focus its energy. And if it's a focus, then there must be a way to disrupt it. The diagram showed a series of pressure points, not physical buttons or levers, but what appeared to be psychic conduits, energy pathways designed to interact with the nexus itself. It indicated a sequence, a specific order in which these conduits needed to be activated or deactivated, perhaps using a specific frequency or intention. Thorne, in his madness, had created both the key and the lock. "We need to find the core conduits," Emily yelled over the rising hum, pointing to vague locations on the diagram that seemed to correspond with certain structural elements of the boiler room. "There are 4 of them. We have to activate them in the right order, or we make it worse." The manifestations intensified, their forms becoming almost solid, their silent screams echoing louder in their minds. The weeping woman lunged at Jessica, her grasp almost connecting. The screaming child floated inches from Emily's face, its black eyes boring into her soul. The faceless doctor pressed against David, a palpable weight. "For points," Michael shouted, trying to clear his head, fighting the encroaching despair. "We split up. Mark, you know this place better than anyone. Emily, you have the map. David, Jessica, with me. We have to work fast." The very air began to tear, thin cracks appearing in the reality around them, shimmering like heat haze but far more sinister. The hum intensified into a deafening roar, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated violently. The drain was not just feeding, it was actively tearing its way into their world. "This is it," Mark said, his eyes now blazing with a grim determination. "The only way out is through. If we don't seal this, there won't be anything left to go back to." The race against oblivion had begun. The asylum was no longer a hunting ground for ghosts. It was a battleground for reality itself. Their lives, and perhaps the fate of countless others, hinged on their ability to decipher Thorne's mad genius and close the cosmic wound he had opened. The true horror wasn't a monster they could see, but a void that threatened to consume everything, and they were standing right at its precipice. Mark, with a final resolute nod, pointed towards the first conduit, indicated on Emily's diagram, a darkened, rusted pipe leading into the very heart of the boiler. "There. David, you're with me. Michael, Jessica, Emily, find the others. We activate them simultaneously, or this whole place collapses into itself." The asylum groaned, a sound like a leviathan dying or perhaps being born. The air thickened, pressing down like a physical weight, stealing the breath from their lungs. Liam shoved David forward, the heat from the boiler room now an inferno not of fire, but of pure, concentrated dread. The massive boiler, a relic of an age long past, pulsed with an unholy light, its metal skin rippling as if alive. Ghostly hands, translucent and starved, clawed at the air around it, trying to pull David back, to absorb him into the swirling vortex of agony that now defined the room. "Go! Activate it!" Liam roared, his voice raw, as he wrestled with a force that felt like 100 invisible hands trying to tear him limb from limb. The device, an intricate array of circuits and crystals, glowed ominously in his hand. He had to jam it into the heart of that pulsating metal, into the very core of the asylum's dark heart. Meanwhile, Michael, Jessica, and Emily scattered, the floor beneath their feet groaning, threatening to give way. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling, mingling with the chilling mist that now permeated every corridor. The asylum wasn't just groaning. It was screaming, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that vibrated in their bones. Michael ran towards the hydrotherapy wing, a place notorious for its chilling whispers. He knew the energy node had to be there, perhaps in the very tub where so many had been submerged in icy horror. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rusted tubs filled with stagnant, black water. The air grew frigid, a cold that bit deeper than any winter wind. A spectral figure, gaunt and dripping wet, rose from one of the tubs, its eyes hollow, its mouth agape in a silent scream. Michael didn't stop, didn't flinch. He just ran, his heart hammering against his ribs, searching for the telltale shimmer of residual energy, the focal point for the device. He found it near the largest, most corroded tub, a faint, almost invisible distortion in the air. He fumbled with his device, his fingers numb with cold and terror. Jessica, spurred by an instinct she couldn't explain, raced towards the old lobotomy theater, a place of unspeakable suffering. The stench of antiseptic and old blood, though long gone, seemed to cling to the walls, thick and cloying. The tiered seating was empty, but she felt eyes on her, hundreds of them, the ghostly audience of past atrocities. On the operating table, a spectral form lay strapped down, writhing in silent agony. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, so dense it felt like she was swimming through it. She saw the node, a beacon of dark light, flickering right above the spectral patient's head. It was as if the device was meant to absorb the very essence of that lingering pain. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the asylum's dying shriek. She pulled out her device, her hands trembling. Emily, ever the pragmatist, headed for the Central Administration Office, a place of control and systematic cruelty. The old filing cabinets stood like sentinels, silent witnesses to forgotten lives. But as she entered, the files burst open, paper flying everywhere, swirling into a chaotic vortex of forgotten names and diagnoses. A chorus of whispers, a cacophony of pleas and commands, flooded her mind, threatening to overwhelm her. The temperature plummeted, and she saw her breath fog in the air. The node was there, pulsating on the desk where countless lives had been signed away. It wasn't just a device. It was a conduit for the asylum's oppressive will. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the spectral hands that tried to push her away from the desk, and prepared her device. Back in the boiler room, Liam fought to hold back the encroaching darkness. David, his face a mask of grim determination, struggled with the primary device. The boiler itself seemed to fight back, emitting pulses of raw psychic energy that slammed into him, knocking him back, searing his skin with an invisible fire. Phantom chains rattled, and the screams of 1,000 tortured souls echoed from within the boiler's belly. "It's fighting me," David gasped, sweat pouring down his face, his vision blurring. "I can't get it to link. Hold on. Just hold it there." Liam yelled, his own strength waning. He could feel the asylum trying to consume him, to drag him into its collapsing, burgeoning form. "Michael, Jessica, Emily, are you ready?" He bellowed into his comms, the static almost drowning out his voice. "Ready?" Michael's voice crackled, strained and breathless. "Ready?" Jessica's voice was fierce, punctuated by a gasp. "Ready?" Emily's voice was tight with effort. "All right. On my mark," Liam yelled, focusing every ounce of his will. The asylum bucked, a violent tremor that nearly sent them all to their knees. A massive crack splintered across the boiler's surface, glowing with an internal malevolent light. "Now! All at once! Activate!" A surge of energy so immense it felt like an explosion ripped through the asylum. David, with a primal scream, slammed his device into the glowing crack in the boiler. A blinding flash erupted, followed by a deafening roar that wasn't just sound, but a physical force. In the hydrotherapy room, Michael plunged his device into the swirling energy. The spectral figure shrieked, a sound that finally broke free from its silent agony, and then dissolved into mist, leaving only the smell of ozone and the black water. Jessica, with a surge of adrenaline, activated her device above the lobotomy table. The writhing spectral patient froze, its eyes wide with a sudden profound peace, before dissipating into a shower of sparkling dust. The air in the theater cleared, the oppressive weight lifting. Emily, despite the spectral hands clawing at her, managed to activate her device on the desk. The tornado of papers instantly dropped, settling back into neat piles. The cacophony of whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. The coordinated activation ripped through the fabric of the asylum. For a terrifying, eternal second, everything went utterly silent. The groaning stopped. The screaming died. The rattling chains vanished. The oppressive weight lifted. Then a tremendous inward-sucking sound, like a giant gulping down the very air, reverberated through the building. The internal lights, which had flickered erratically, suddenly brightened, then went out completely, plunging the entire asylum into absolute darkness. "Run! Everybody run!" Liam's voice was a desperate cry in the sudden void. They didn't need to be told twice. Guided by the faint glow of their flashlights, they stumbled through the collapsing corridors. Walls were caving in, dust and debris rained down, and the ground beneath them shifted violently. It was an earthquake, a structural collapse, but it felt more profound, like the very spirit of the asylum was imploding. Michael, Jessica, and Emily scrambled towards the emergency exit they had marked earlier, the one that led outside towards the overgrown grounds. They could hear Liam and David's shouts, closer now, indicating they were also making their way out of the boiler room's immediate vicinity. They burst through the heavy steel door, gasping for breath, out into the cool night air. The moon, a sliver of silver, hung high above the churning clouds. Behind them, the asylum groaned one last, shuddering breath. A deep, resonant thump echoed through the night, and then an unnerving silence. They turned, flashlights scanning the imposing structure. It was still there physically, but something had changed. The oppressive aura was gone. The windows, once dark and menacing, now seemed merely empty. The crumbling walls were just old stone, not a manifestation of internal decay. The asylum looked dead. Not just disused, but truly, utterly dead. Like a husk, its malevolent spirit finally exorcised. Liam and David emerged moments later, covered in dust and grime, their faces pale and drawn but alive. They collapsed onto the grass, chests heaving, adrenaline slowly receding. They had done it. They had stopped whatever monstrous entity had been trying to manifest or consume the asylum. They had prevented its collapse, or its horrific rebirth. But as they lay there, catching their breath, a chilling realization settled over them, heavier than any dust. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an absence of everything they had known inside. The constant hum of fear, the oppressive weight, the whispers, they were gone from the asylum. But were they gone from them? As David slowly pushed himself up, His eyes, usually sharp and inquisitive, held a distant, haunted look. Michael kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting a spectral hand to grasp him. Jessica's hands trembled uncontrollably, even as she tried to compose herself. Emily stared blankly at the moon, a faint, unsettling smile playing on her lips, a smile that held no joy, only a profound, unsettling peace that seemed alien to her. Liam looked at his team, his brave, exhausted team. They had walked out of the asylum physically intact. They hadn't become the ghost hunters who never returned. But as he met their eyes one by one, he saw it. A subtle shift, a lingering shadow, a profound, unshakable alteration. They had faced something beyond human comprehension, and while they had won, they hadn't escaped unscathed. They had brought a piece of the asylum out with them, not in their backs but deep within their very souls. The asylum was dead, its dark heart silenced. But the five of them, Liam, David, Michael, Jessica, and Emily, now carried its faint, indelible echo. They had returned, yes, but not entirely. They were the ghost hunters who returned, but a part of them, a vital, unidentifiable part, had been left behind in that silent, dead place. And a piece of that silent, dead place had come home with them, forever changing the people they once were. The true cost of their victory, they would only come to understand in the long, silent nights that lay ahead, forever haunted by the asylum that had almost claimed them.